So I just got back from Django Unchained, and I've been talking about it on Facebook, and I figured I may as well just make a quick video about it. And as you know, when I make a quick video, it is always going to be brief, to the point, with no rambling. It'll be very succinct. Handful of, catchphrases you can take to the bank with you, and that'll be it. Clearly will not be a half-hour rant. Yeah, this movie kind of sucks. I don't know if I'd say that. Well, it doesn't help that I'm a big fan of the original Django movie from 1966. It's directed by a director that I really like, Sergio Corbucci, or however you say his name. And it was at the time considered like the most violent Western anyone had ever seen. It was, of course, a spaghetti Western prompted by the Man with No Name trilogy, which everyone thought was really violent. No, Corbucci one-upped everyone and made Django. There were then a series of movies made. Saying series is probably too. Several movies were subsequently made that were like Django-sploitation. Like, they took the Django name, literally just the name Django, and stuck it on one of the characters or in the title of the movie. In the case of the star Franco Nero, a lot of movies he was in subsequently had Django in the title, even though he wasn't playing a character named Django, to cash in on the success of the 1966 film. That's understandable, because it's really good. It's really good. It's not merely that it's violent. Like most movies that are like legendary for being violent, not all, but most, it's more that it affects you. The violence gets at you, and that's why it feels violent. Now, in some cases, the movie itself is not really that violent. In fact, in the case of Tarantino, oftentimes that's true. Long stretches of his movies have no violence. This movie is actually one of them. But the violent scenes make an impression or whatever. Or like Taxi Driver, where there's only a few violent scenes, but there's like a violent tone to the movie. Django legitimately has a lot of violence in it, but it makes a deeper impression on you because, and this is something that movies don't, as a rule, do anymore. And I am not like a nostalgic, like, oh, movies used to always be better, blah, blah, blah. Like, that's really lazy thinking. But there are certain respects in which I think movies used to be better. Others in which they're better now. But one of the areas in which they used to be better was that they gave their characters time to breathe. They gave the movie time to kind of find its feet, but you get immersed in it. I mean, that's especially like, you have to get immersed in like a science fiction world, and that can, if it's done well, that can be really quick. But like in a period piece or something like that, you have to kind of soak in it for a while, I think, to really feel like to really let yourself get into the world it's presenting to you. That might just be me, but this movie is a good example because I never felt like I was watching the Wild West. I was constantly thinking about like, oh, they chose to do this, that's kind of cool, or this is an interesting interpretation of what was going on back then. I don't know, I never bought it. I was constantly being pulled out of it. The original Django I sort of go with. And the thing about the action scenes is, before any big dramatic gunfight or something like that, there's several minutes, or at least a long pause before, where you see Django kind of setting up and waiting for it to happen. Or there'll be scenes where he's talking with somebody and about imminently coming fights or dramatic showdowns, and they're very quiet, they're very understated. You get a chance to kind of sit with the characters and feel their concern, and I really like that. It makes the payoff of when he actually does go out and have these big dramatic gunfights that much more satisfying. And for what it's worth, there's people are already talking about this like gunfight near the end of Django Unchained. It's really bloody and graphic, and I had a friend who said he was writhing in his seat. Y'all are wusses. There's a gunfight at the half-hour point of Django. Doesn't have that much blood from what I remember, but it is so much more like it got me really, really into it. Like it pulls something on you that at least I wasn't expecting. And it's huge and it's dramatic. Like, it could easily have been the climactic scene of a movie. And it would have worked just fine as that. And that's the half-hour point. And it doesn't lose, like, steam. In fact, the actual climax is technically smaller. It's not as big and dramatic and I guess overdone, if you want to say that. but the emotion has continued to build from there on, and you've gotten to know the character a bit more, and you've gotten to know him and sympathize with him. He's not just a kind of stolid, rugged Western hero, even though he's at the beginning you think he is, and he does that really well. But the more you learn about him, and the more you just see him even struggle to pull off the badass stuff that he does do so well, you care a lot more about his fate at the end of the movie. It's got a really great, and that pays off with a great final shot as well. And the scene where, there's a scene where something is done to him that, because of what it entailed, it's not just what you're watching something really gruesome. Of course, in that sense, the new movie is a lot more gruesome. You see bones and blood, chunks of it coming out of people's bodies. Yet you don't see that in the original Django, but it's a lot more visceral. It's really horrifying that it's done to these specific characters and for these specific reasons. And you've gotten to know them a bit, so you're invested. It's weird to be saying this, because this feels like this is filmmaking 101, and yet Quentin Tarantino, a legendary filmmaker who didn't go to film school, watch a whole bunch of movies, and just knows how they're made, chose not to take that route in this movie. Now, Mark Kermode, a critic I really like, has pointed out that in Tarantino's movies, all the characters talk like Tarantino. I think not utterly fair. I think that he has nuance between his characters. And it helps that he casts really good actors to kind of flesh out personalities. In this case, Christoph Waltz, who was, of course, the best thing about Inglourious Basterds, playing the Nazi Sherlock Holmes. Also, the best thing about this movie. I always felt like I should have been annoyed, because I think his performance comes this close to, affectation. He plays this dentist turned bounty hunter, who is very articulate and erudite, and very calculating. And the way he talks, it's on that, razor's edge of affectation, of kind of look at, I'm violent, and yet I'm so eloquent and articulate. And maybe if I were to read it on a page, it would seem that way, but Christoph Waltz just sells it so well. He's really good. But I don't know that I really care about the characters. And you'd think that a movie about almost 3 hour long movie, I guess, or 2.5 hour long movie, you would think I'd care more about Jamie Foxx and the fact that he wants to reunite with his wife. You'd think you'd have time to kind of grow that and develop that. Give me enough flashbacks or something. Tell me more about the characters. I know nothing about Jamie Foxx in this movie, really. Not to say there aren't any scenes where I don't care about him or I don't feel bad for him, but there's no consistency to it either. He becomes a hero pretty spontaneously. Apparently, despite never having been trained as far as we're told, or as I realized, he's like a crack shot the moment he picks up a gun. And not just a crack shot, but the fastest gun in the South. And I get that because he's been abused all his life, it makes sense that he's kind of this hardened killer very quickly. That I don't have any trouble buying that. But I felt like it didn't juggle that aspect. I got that a lot more than the passion he feels for his wife. There's how do I put this? There's a lot of scenes with emotion in this movie, but it's all at the service of the plot. There are scenes where you see slaves horribly abused and torn apart by dogs, and it elicits emotion. But you don't so much feel bad for you feel bad for the slaves, obviously, but what the real feeling he's going for is anger at the people who are inflicting the harm, so that it'll be cathartic at the end when they get their comeuppance. There are scenes where, you realize how much he cares for his wife and how much he wants to reunite with his wife. I just realized I didn't explain the plot. I feel like you probably know. He's a slave who's been separated from his wife and becomes a bounty hunter and tries to reunite with his wife. And there are scenes where you're shown how much he cares for her, and you do feel something, but again, it's in the service of and now this scene where he's trying to conceal the fact that he knows his wife, it's building tension, right? Because he loves his wife so much. It's all done purely for the service of feeling an emotion that you're supposed to feel in this scene. You don't get to know any of the characters themselves. And that's maybe deliberate almost, because you could say this movie is an above-average entry in the Django saga, in this series of Django exploitation. And the way you just have a bunch of interchangeable cowboy heroes. You just have one that this time happens to also be the protagonist of the Nigger Charlie movies. Like, maybe that's, the exception is that instead of being called Charlie, he's called Django this time. You combine the two. This movie's a lot more like the movies where Fred Williamson played the Black Bounty Hunter, Nigger Charlie. There's three of them, all of which have that word in the title. You'd think after watching 3 hours of a movie where they use that word like every couple of minutes, I'd be like a bit inured to it, but I still feel a bit uncomfortable with it. But, and yeah, if that word offends you, like, I would avoid this movie. I really would. I'd also avoid Tarantino in general, to be honest with you. It reminds me of an interesting special feature on the Reservoir Dogs DVD, where some cultural scholar, because cultural scholars like love Tarantino, she talks about how he's a lot like Eminem in the way that he's a white rapper. And he's appropriating something that came from black culture, and specifically from black oppression, kind of the response to that, kind of appropriating that as an aesthetic, as a tool of his own art. And, of course, people like Spike Lee take great offense to Tarantino doing that. Samuel L. Jackson defends Tarantino doing that, but it's interesting that even in this movie, Samuel L. Jackson plays the black slave in charge of the household, the Uncle Tom kind of character, who, like, is devoted to his white masters and sells out all his fellow black people and all this kind of thing. It's kind of an interesting role for Samuel L. Jackson, who's been a defender of like Quentin Tarantino exploiting black people, being in a movie where he plays a black guy who enables white exploitation of blacks. Just saying. He is good though. He is really good. Actually, this is one of my. I'll say this actually. This is one of my favorite Samuel L. Jackson performances in a Tarantino movie since Pulp Fiction. He actually is quite good in this. Why don't I like Tarantino? A couple of reasons. Because, yeah, ultimately this movie doesn't really work for me. At no real point was I just relaxing and kind of letting what was happening happen. I kept thinking, oh, this is what Tarantino is doing. Oh, this is what he's referencing. Oh, look, that's Franco Nero, who played the original Django. Oh, nobody in the audience is oohing and ahhing? Well, that's okay. Oh, here's Tarantino. Jeez, he's let himself go. He could probably afford to lose some weight. Everyone in the audience knows him. Yeah, they're all oohing and ahhing. I have nothing wrong. I have no problem with people ripping off each other. All stories have been ripped off. There's no problem with that. I'm a traditionalist in my politics and my philosophy and my religion. I'm all about like borrowed stories and secondhand, things that have been received and passed down. I'm all about that. What bothers me is, and this is snobby. This is kind of snobby of me, but it is bothersome to me when people don't catch that you're referencing something else. It's just upsetting to me that people are gonna like praise Tarantino for being original when what he's done is ripped off movies they haven't seen. Reservoir Dogs. I really like Reservoir Dogs, for the record. It's a ripoff of City on Fire. Like, it's a pretty direct ripoff of City on Fire. And yeah, he's almost... I think Cracked.com once said he's not so much a director as he is like a cinematic disc jockey. It's not a bad way of putting it. If people realize that, I don't think I'd mind so much, but people are impressed by the good stuff in his movies that he by and large stole, or they catch that he's referencing these obscure movies, and they feel this camaraderie with him. And kind of these nerdgasms, and so they like him for that reason. He's like a brother in arms. Mark Kermode, who's a big fan of exploitation movies, sees through Tarantino, and I appreciate him for that. It's not to say I don't find anything in this movie entertaining. There is some dialogue. I mean, Tarantino's dialogue is very indulgent, but he is good at it. And there's definitely some really good dialogue in this movie, and some good action set pieces. It's good. The music is good, but it's. Again, like, I kept thinking, that's funny. He chose to put a rap song in this film set, in the time of, antebellum South. He chose a Johnny Cash song that I really like for this scene. That's curious and anachronistic, but clearly, I always got the sense of how deliberately he was doing things, and it didn't delight me. It just, somehow I wasn't invested. Again, that's part of why I don't like him. I always feel like I'm seeing through him. Like, it's sort of like going to a magic show after you've seen all the tricks explained. You can still kind of appreciate it, but it doesn't awe you anymore, right? The other thing about him is, it's one thing if you don't intend your movie to be about anything. That doesn't necessarily bother me, to be honest with you. But that's it. There's a difference between that, like just intending to write an entertaining story, and aggressively excluding meaning from your story, aggressively trying to make your story nihilistic. And that's what I find with Tarantino. He's dedicated to making these movies about porn. They're porn, is what they are. They're pornographic movies that involve violence and language and plot twists, but they're not aspiring to anything higher. And again, like, it's not like everything Spielberg does is actually, when he tries to be important, sometimes it's quite cloying. But when he makes an entertaining movie, it's entertaining because like it's open to themes, like Indiana Jones. It's just an entertaining story in its own right, but you can also get the themes out of it about heroism because that's what happens when you make something that's good, and just like let it be good. But Tarantino, like, Reservoir Dogs is aggressively nihilistic, right? It's aggressively like gleeful about the fact that there's kind of no hope and it's all kind of inane and pointless. He'll play upon things that are like Kill Bill has, this theme about this woman's pregnancy and the fact that her child made her want to get out of crime, out of assassinations. But even that's clearly just like to accelerate a plot. It's like so there can be this interesting reveal at the end of the second movie. It doesn't feel like he understands it at all, or he has any real like emotional connection or understanding of the idea of pregnancy or of a new life. I mean, look at the guy himself. He's like sort of this selfish, like nerdy, self-absorbed, narcissistic, like a socially awkward jerk. Like, and that comes out in his films. And even here, like, there are themes of like a man who's so in love he wants to be reunited, and he refers to like German legend about Siegfried and everything about it. But there's no emotional connection to it. It's just using this human experience for the sake of a plot. The only exception I can think of to that is Pulp Fiction, when Samuel L. Jackson's character becomes a minister. That's the only time I can think of when he gives sort of an out to this nihilistic worldview of someone who actually finds meaning. And of course, as Crack.com also pointed out, that also corresponds to the life of a saint, Saint Moses the Black, which is kind of interesting. And I think that's kind of interesting that he's borrowing from a Corbucci movie in that case, because Corbucci was deliberate about this. It seems to me he was kind of a Marxist, and kind of a hopeless one though. Like not like a Marxist in the sense that he thought that like society was going to advance teleologically towards a Marxist state. It seems like he thought Marx's diagnosis was right, but that the medicine was too late to cure the patient. You can see this in another movie he made called The Great Silence, which is a really good like takedown of the Western genre, where instead of it's set during this historic like really snowy winter period where it was really cold, and so instead of it being the typical Western landscape, it's all snow. And you have the strong silent hero, but in this case he's silent because like his voice box has been cut, right? Like he keeps subverting these familiar themes, and it ends. And he's sort of standing up for this oppressed group of Mormons, and at the end of it, it's like one of the bleakest endings you'll ever see. Like, he recut a happier ending that we don't have any audio for, from what I remember, and it doesn't make sense. Like, a guy who clearly died is not dead in it. But the ending of the movie, the finished cut, is like completely hopeless and evil wins. That seems very deliberate. I mean, it's been observed that Corbucci is dedicating this to social revolutionaries, like in his view, like Jesus or Che Guevara, who failed, again, in his interpretation. Stood up for something higher, got killed for it, and it didn't end up working. And the fact is that Silence, the character of The Great Silence, his hands get kind of mutilated in the movie. And that's sort of a reference to Jesus Christ, getting his hands mutilated, or to Che Guevara, whose hands were cut off and sent to Fidel Castro, right? And Django also gets his hands crushed by horse hooves. And that's actually why he's named Django. It's a reference to a musician who had like paralyzed fingers and had to kind of play stringed instruments in spite of that. Just like Django has to use a gun in spite of the fact that his hands have been like wrecked. So he's deliberately creating a very, very like nihilistic universe, but there's something conscientious about it. He's saying something with it, and like Django has to kind of overcome this. Like there's a brothel in the movie that sort of stands out because it's like the only like dopamine that you can take in the face of this kind of very hopeless society, and even the ending is like not that upbeat. And Tarantino doesn't really do that. I mean, he really could make a movie that, because he sort of has a similar worldview. I mean, like, in the way that he doesn't really have heroes in a conventional way. He kind of has deliberately charming anti-heroes. But he doesn't really seem to believe in higher ideals, and he seems to be aware of that. For example, like, one of Christoph Waltz's refrains in this movie after he kills somebody is he'll explain to everyone around, like, I'm working for the law, I'm a bounty hunter, so what I'm doing is perfectly legitimate, alright, like, I'm in the line of duty right now. And I thought that was interesting because that's almost like what Tarantino does. Like, he justifies his violence by sort of putting it in a context, just like Christoph Waltz says, oh, well, like, this is all perfectly legitimate, so you can't really get upset about it. The glaring example of this is like Inglourious Basterds, right, where because these war crimes, which is what they're doing, is war crimes, because they're happening to Nazis, people kind of like it. People really enjoy seeing, like, the bear Jew hit a Nazi in the head with a baseball bat. And in this case, and I know that Tarantino was talking about making a movie about John Brown, who was an abolitionist who, like, went out, like, scalping, slave owners with, like, a cutlass. Who played by Johnny Cash, incidentally, in the miniseries, the Ken Burns one, I believe. That's Johnny Cash who plays John Brown. That clip's on YouTube, check it out. I know that Tarantino was thinking of making an adaptation of John Brown's life. I don't know that I assume that ended up becoming this. Maybe he'll still end up doing one. But, I mean, that'd be very in keeping with the Inglourious Basterds thing of using violence against a completely acceptable target. And because they're an acceptable target, you can go totally overboard and horrific in the violence, and it'll be okay. And he seems to be aware that he's a hypocrite this way, because Inglourious Basterds, like, you have a bunch of people, like, sitting around watching a movie where Americans are killed and enjoying themselves, and then they're all burned in a theater, and we kind of enjoy ourselves, but we're in a theater watching this, so are we any better? That kind of thing. And in the same way, we see Leonardo DiCaprio's character, this, like, corrupt slave owner, as opposed to, all the, like, virtuous slave owners. But, like, an exceptionally hypocritical kind of slave owner who pits slaves together in, like, fights to the death, like, almost like bum fights for his own amusement. And he's like, and this is supposed to be really horrific to us, but we're also, like, watching people pit against each other in really violent confrontation for our own amusement, right? And it's sort of like, well, are we any better for engaging in that, right? And I guess to some, again, it seems like Tarantino is aware of this and he's deliberately playing on it, but I don't really respect that. Like, you can be self-aware about the fact that you're a hypocrite, but that doesn't make you any less of a hypocrite. That's just the difference between being, like, it's the difference between being a douchebag and a jerk, right? The jerk's aware of it, and he's kind of smug about it, and that makes it a bit more tolerable, but it's still obnoxious, and it's still morally questionable. And again, I said earlier that what Tarantino makes is porn, right? People will, like, take issue with that. But, I mean, look at who he actually associates with. Everyone hates Eli Roth for making torture porn, right? But who's Eli Roth's, like, financier, right? Who's his, like, his mentor? Who got his start? Like, it was Tarantino. It is Tarantino. I very much think of the Tarantino-Eli Roth relationship as being like Hitler and the Red Skull, like in the comics where Hitler says, like, I could make anyone evil. I could even make this bellboy, like, an evil tyrant, and he picks him and turns him into the Red Skull. That's very much what I imagine happens with Tarantino and Eli Roth. Like, I could even take this talentless hack here, this Eli Roth character, and I could even make him a successful director. Just watch me. And of course, Eli Roth plays the Bear Jew in Inglourious Basterds, and I don't think that's a coincidence, because they're fundamentally doing the same thing. The difference is that Tarantino is, like, 3 times as good as it at directing and at writing dialogue and at getting actors as Eli Roth. Like, he's a vastly better filmmaker, but they're, in principle, doing the same thing. And I think that's why they like each other so much and work with each other so much. Anyways, all that said, Django Unchained, it didn't feel that long. I didn't feel the length. I didn't writhe that much of the blood. I didn't find the violence that. I liked Christoph Waltz. I liked some of the cameos. I liked seeing Ted Neely of Jesus Christ Superstar fame. I liked some of the music. I liked some of the action set pieces. I liked some of the dialogue. Oh, the dialogue was really good. I have to admit. You just expect that of Tarantino, right? You could probably like, cut together a best of compilation from this movie that I'd really like. I wouldn't say don't see it, but if you're gonna see it, don't be one of those people who bugs me. Watch the original Django as well. Watch The Great Silence. I think it's a very underrated movie. I could even see myself doing a review of that one sometime. And be aware of what it is you're watching. Be aware that you're like signing up to watch like spaghetti exploitation porn. If you're willing to watch some of that, you'll have a good time. Take care.